I found out my wife had been hiding money in a secret account for years to support her ex-boyfriend, and now she's demanding I don't touch our savings after I filed for divorce. My wife, Sarah, 34F, and I, 35M, have been together for 6 years, married for 4. From the outside, we look like your typical happy couple. We split our finances pretty evenly, with both of us contributing to a joint account for household bills, vacations, and savings. I work as a project manager, which means I'm the spreadsheet guy, tracking our finances, keeping tabs on our budget, and making sure we're on track to meet our goals. Sarah owns a small but successful online business, and while her income fluctuates, we always manage to keep everything balanced. At least that's what I thought. One day, I was doing my routine check of our finances. I noticed a series of small but consistent withdrawals from our joint account, $50 here, $75 there. I'm not typically a suspicious person, but something about these charges felt off. When I asked Sarah about them, she brushed it off, saying they were for business expenses. I didn't push it. After all, I trusted her, and I figured it wasn't worth making a fuss over what seemed like minor expenses. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. A few weeks later, I noticed the same types of withdrawals. This time, they were slightly larger, $100, $150. It was as if the amounts were increasing over time. I asked Sarah again, and she got defensive. She told me she didn't need to justify every little expense to me, and that she had a right to spend money from the account too. That put me in a weird position. She was right, of course. It wasn't my place to police her spending, especially since we were both contributing to the account. But something felt wrong. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't ignore the red flags. That night, after she went to bed, I decided to dig a little deeper. I went through our account history, tracing every withdrawal over the past 6 months. As I stared at the screen, my heart started racing. There were transfers made to a specific bank account on a near-monthly basis, and they always followed a similar pattern: an initial small amount, followed by larger transfers. The account wasn't one I recognized, and it didn't belong to any service or vendor we'd used before. Curiosity got the best of me, so I did something I probably shouldn't have. I started searching for any links to this account online. After some digging, I managed to connect it to someone named Tom. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. That is, until I saw his full name, Thomas Adams. That was the name of Sarah's ex-boyfriend, the guy she dated before we met. The guy I'd never given a second thought to because he was supposedly long out of her life. My stomach dropped. Why was Sarah transferring money to her ex? I had no answer. I felt a surge of anger, hurt, and betrayal all at once. I wanted to wake her up right then and there and demand an explanation. But instead, I sat back, trying to wrap my head around what I'd just uncovered. I needed to know how deep this went, and I needed to approach it calmly. If she was hiding this, what else was she hiding? The next day, I decided I couldn't let this fester any longer. I confronted Sarah as soon as she got home from work. I asked her directly, "Why have you been sending money to Tom?" Her face went pale, and for a moment she just stared at me stunned. Then she tried to cover it up, claiming she was only helping him out because he was going through a rough time. She said it was purely platonic, that they hadn't even met up in person, and that she only felt sorry for him. I listened, but her explanations felt hollow, rehearsed. She assured me that it was just money and that it meant nothing. I wasn't convinced. If it was just money, why hadn't she told me? Why the secrecy, the defensiveness, the lies? It was as if my world had suddenly shifted, and everything I thought I knew was unraveling. I asked her how long she'd been doing this, and she admitted it had been going on for nearly 2 years. 2 years of secretly supporting her ex while I was none the wiser. I didn't know what to say. I felt completely blindsided. 2 years? 2 years of her taking money from our shared account to send to a man she swore meant nothing to her. I thought about all the vacations we'd planned, the home renovations we'd put off, the savings goals we'd set together. All the while, she'd been siphoning off funds to support someone who wasn't a part of our lives. That night, I didn't know where we stood. I spent hours pacing, unable to sleep, replaying every conversation, every moment where she'd been hiding this from me. I realized then that it wasn't just about the money. It was about trust, or rather, the lack of it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't know who Sarah really was anymore, and I wasn't sure I ever had. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread. The night had done nothing to ease my anger or the knot in my stomach. I had spent hours lying awake, replaying Sarah's confession, and each time I thought about it, I felt a surge of betrayal all over again. I needed answers, real answers, not the weak justification she tried to give me the night before. As I walked downstairs, I found her in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out the window, lost in thought. "Sarah," I started, my voice steady but tense. "We need to talk. I don't think you've been entirely honest with me about this thing with Tom." She sighed, setting down her coffee mug, but she didn't meet my eyes. "Mark, I already told you. He was just going through a rough time, and I felt like I had to help him. You have no idea what he's been through." "What he's been through?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "And what about what you've put me through?" 2 years, Sarah. 2 years of lying to my face, and sneaking around, hiding money, and you think I'm supposed to just brush it off because he had a hard time?" She shifted uncomfortably, finally looking at me. "It wasn't like that. I didn't want to tell you because I knew you'd overreact, just like you are now." "Overreact?" I repeated, my voice incredulous. "Sarah, you've been stealing from our savings to support another man, your ex-boyfriend of all people. How is that not a big deal?" She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "Mark, he's the one who helped me through a lot of tough times before we met. I wouldn't be who I am without him. When he called me, he sounded desperate. He was losing his apartment, he had debts piling up, and I felt like I couldn't just ignore him. I owed him that much." "Owed him?" I scoffed. "You owe him nothing. You're my wife. We have a life together, a future we've been planning, and you're throwing that away for some guy you dated years ago." She crossed her arms, a defensive posture I'd come to recognize all too well. "It's not like I was cheating on you, Mark. It's just money. And that's supposed to make it okay." I shot back. "You know what that money means to us. That's the money we were going to use to buy a bigger house, to start a family. Did you even think about that when you were handing it over to him?" "Of course I thought about it," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But he was in trouble, Mark. He has no one else." "And you didn't even think to tell me?" I asked, feeling more hurt than I had before. "You decided this was more important than our marriage." Sarah looked down, her face twisted in a mixture of guilt and frustration. "I didn't want to drag you into it. I thought I could handle it on my own. I thought I could keep it separate." "Separate?" I laughed bitterly. "This isn't something you can separate, Sarah. You betrayed my trust. You've been taking our money, our savings, and giving it to another man. I don't care what your intentions were. You went behind my back. You lied to me." She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. "You've been supporting your ex for 2 years. Do you realize how insane that sounds? How am I supposed to believe that you haven't seen him, that you're not involved with him in other ways?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "You're accusing me of cheating on you now?" "I'm accusing you of hiding things from me," I replied, trying to keep my tone level. "What am I supposed to think? You say you're just helping him, but you didn't think I deserved to know." "That's not how our marriage works, Sarah. You don't get to make these decisions on your own and pretend like it doesn't affect me." She sighed again, rubbing her temples as if this conversation was as exhausting for her as it was for me. "Fine. I screwed up. I should have told you. But I didn't want you to get the wrong idea. I was just trying to help him out of a bad situation." "So you think that justifies lying to me for 2 years?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've shattered any trust I had in you. I can't even look at you the same way anymore." For a moment there was silence between us, a thick tension hanging in the air. Then she finally spoke, her voice softer, almost pleading. "Mark, I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought you'd make me choose between helping him and staying with you." "I shouldn't have had to make you choose, Sarah," I replied, feeling the weight of her betrayal settling heavily on my chest. "You should have chosen me from the start. I was supposed to be the one you confided in, the one you trusted. Instead, you turned to him." She closed her eyes, her face etched with regret. I know I messed up. I thought I could handle it on my own." "Well, you couldn't," I said coldly. "And now we're here." We stood there, staring at each other, and I realized that this conversation wasn't going to fix anything. She had made her choice, and it wasn't me. I didn't know how to move forward from here, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't go back to the way things were. She had broken something between us, something that couldn't be easily repaired. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Sarah's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please, Mark, don't do this. I'm sorry. I'll make it right." "I don't think you can," I replied, my heart aching as I watched her crumble. "You've made your choices, and I have to make mine. I deserve better than this." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen. As I left the house, I knew I was stepping into an uncertain future, but I also knew I couldn't stay. Sarah had chosen to keep secrets, to prioritize someone else over our marriage, and that was something I could never forgive. The woman I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized, and as much as it hurt, I knew that leaving was the only choice I had left. In the days following my decision to leave, I felt like I was floating through a haze. I moved in with a close friend, Rob, who was more than happy to offer his spare bedroom while I figured things out. He had been my best friend since college, and though he didn't press me for details, I knew he understood that something serious had happened between Sarah and me. On the second night at Rob's place, I finally broke down and told him everything: the hidden bank account, the money she'd been siphoning off, her ex, and how I'd filed for divorce. He listened quietly, nodding occasionally, a mix of sympathy and anger flashing across his face. "Man, I'm sorry," he said once I'd finished, shaking his head. "I can't believe she'd do that to you. It's like you were living with a stranger all this time." "Yeah," I muttered, staring into my drink. "That's what it feels like." She was so quick to jump to his aid, and yet she couldn't even be honest with me. It's like she cared more about him than our marriage. Rob leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know it's tough right now, but honestly, Mark, you're doing the right thing. You can't trust someone who's willing to keep that kind of secret from you. And supporting her ex? I don't even have words for that." Hearing those words from someone else was both a relief and a painful reminder of the mess my life had become. I wanted to believe that I was doing the right thing, that leaving her was the only option, but doubt kept creeping in, whispering that maybe I was being too harsh, that maybe I could have forgiven her if she had been honest sooner. I shook the thought away, knowing it was just my wounded pride trying to rationalize her actions. As the days turned into weeks, I began sorting through the logistics of separating our lives. I arranged to meet Sarah to go over the paperwork for our divorce. She was hesitant, emotional, but I remained firm. I couldn't let her sway me, not after everything that had come to light. The love we had shared felt tainted, overshadowed by her betrayal. When we finally met at the lawyer's office, Sarah looked worn out, her eyes red from what I assumed were countless nights spent crying. But I felt nothing. I was numb, my feelings buried beneath a mountain of hurt and resentment. The woman sitting across from me was a stranger, someone I couldn't recognize as the person I had once loved. As we went through the documents, I noticed she seemed uneasy, her gaze flickering over the paperwork, her hands trembling slightly. "Sarah, is there something you're not telling me?" I asked, unable to hold back my frustration. "You keep acting like there's more to this." She took a shaky breath and looked at me, guilt flashing in her eyes. "Mark, I didn't just use our savings to help Tom. I also took out a loan in both of our names. I couldn't cover his debts on my own, so I used our joint credit." The room spun around me. I could feel the anger rising again, this time burning hotter than before. "You took out a loan? In my name? Without telling me?" She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know what else to do. He was in so much trouble, and I thought I could fix it before he found out. I was wrong, Mark. I know I was wrong." I clenched my fists, struggling to control my rage. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about her complete disregard for me, for our marriage, for our future. I felt the last remnants of my love for her wither and die in that moment, replaced by a cold, bitter anger that seeped into my bones. "Sarah, do you even understand what you've done?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You've betrayed me, lied to me, and now you've dragged me into financial ruin to support your ex. How am I supposed to forgive that?" Tears streamed down her face as she reached out, but I pulled away, unable to bear her touch. "I'm so sorry, Mark," she sobbed. "I didn't mean for things to get this out of hand. I never wanted to hurt you." "Then why did you?" I shot back, my voice harsh. "Why did you put him above us, above everything we built together? You had choices, Sarah. You chose him. Over and over, you chose him." She couldn't answer. Instead, she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I watched her, feeling nothing but emptiness, as if the part of me that had once cared had been hollowed out and discarded. After that meeting, I knew there was no going back. The paperwork was finalized within a few months, and we agreed to sell the house to cover the loan she'd taken out. It was painful to see our home, the place we filled with memories, stripped bare and prepared for strangers to inhabit. But there was no other way. She had destroyed everything, and I was left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer made sense. Despite the agony, I took comfort in knowing that I was free from her lies, free to rebuild without the weight of her betrayal holding me back. I threw myself into my work, determined to regain the financial stability she had stolen from me. Slowly, day by day, I began to move forward, the wound she had left starting to heal, though the scars would remain forever. The months following the divorce were some of the hardest I had ever endured. I threw myself into my job, worked late into the night, and tried to forget the life I had once shared with Sarah. Friends reached out, offering support, trying to coax me back into some semblance of normalcy. But I wasn't ready. I didn't want to talk about her, didn't want to recount the details of her betrayal. It was as if saying it all out loud would make it even more real, solidifying the nightmare I had somehow stumbled into. One evening, as I was sifting through some mail, I noticed an envelope from our old bank. I hadn't bothered to change my address with them yet, so they were still sending statements to the apartment I had rented after leaving Sarah. I opened it without much thought, expecting the usual account summary. But as I scanned the statement, my heart began to pound. It was a detailed report of the joint loan Sarah had taken out in our names. I had expected the numbers to be high, but this was astronomical. She had borrowed far more than I realized. My mind reeled as I added up the payments we'd made on the loan versus what was still owed. There was a massive discrepancy. Payments had been made, yes, but they had barely touched the principal amount. Interest and penalties had ballooned, compounding into a seemingly insurmountable debt. Frustrated and desperate for answers, I decided to confront Sarah one last time. I wasn't sure if it was closure I was looking for or just an outlet for the rage that had been building up inside me. I called her, and to my surprise, she answered, sounding hesitant but not entirely shocked to hear from me. "Mark," she said quietly, "why are you calling?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sarah, we need to talk. In person. I have some questions, and I think I deserve answers." After a long pause, she agreed to meet me at a nearby coffee shop. I arrived early, taking a seat near the back where we'd have some privacy. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. She looked exhausted, her face pale, her shoulders hunched as if she were carrying the weight of the world. It was strange seeing her like that. A part of me almost felt pity, but the anger quickly reminded me why I was there. She sat down across from me, avoiding my gaze. "I didn't think I'd see you again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I cut straight to the point. "I got a statement from the bank. Sarah, the loan amount, it's out of control. I don't understand how you could do this." She looked down at her hands, picking at her fingernails nervously. "I know, Mark. I didn't think it would get this bad. I thought I could handle it. I don't know. I was trying to help him, and it all spiraled." By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. "You realize that you didn't just ruin your own finances, right?" I snapped. "You tied me into this mess without my consent. You dragged me down with you, all for a man who doesn't even care about you. Do you know how pathetic that sounds?" She winced at my words, a flicker of pain crossing her face. "I know I made a mistake, Mark. I wasn't thinking clearly. I thought I was helping him, but I see now that he was just using me. He manipulated me." I felt a surge of vindication, but it was tainted by the realization that none of this could be undone. "Why Sarah? Why him? What was so special about him that you were willing to sacrifice everything we had for him?" She looked up at me, her eyes filling with tears. "He was my first love. I know that sounds stupid, but there's a part of me that never stopped caring about him. When he came to me, he made me feel like I was saving him. I got caught up in that, in feeling needed. I never felt like that with you, Mark, not in the same way." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel the anger bubbling up again, threatening to explode. "So what was I then? A safety net? Someone to fall back on while you played savior to a man who didn't deserve it?" She shook her head, tears spilling over her cheeks. "No, Mark, it wasn't like that. I loved you. I still love you. I know I messed up. I know I've lost you, but that doesn't change how I feel." I scoffed, unable to hide my contempt. "Love? You don't do this to someone you love. You lied to me for years, Sarah. You drained our savings and risked our future. For what? For a fantasy?" She looked down, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know I can't make it right. I know there's nothing I can say to fix this. But Mark, please understand, I never meant for this to happen. I got in over my head, and I didn't know how to get out." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "It's too late for apologies, Sarah. I just needed to know why. I needed to understand how you could betray me like this. And now that I know, I'm done. I'm done with you, with this mess you've made of my life." She nodded, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed quietly. I felt a pang of sympathy, but I quickly pushed it away. I had wasted enough time feeling sorry for her. It was time for me to move on, to rebuild my life without her. I stood up, leaving her sitting alone at the table, and walked out of the coffee shop. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of freedom, a weight lifting off my shoulders. I had gotten the answers I came for, and while they weren't what I wanted to hear, they allowed me to close this chapter of my life. It was over. Sarah had made her choices, and I had made mine. I would rebuild, one step at a time, without her, and no matter how hard the road ahead might be, I knew I would be stronger for it. After the divorce, I expected some kind of closure, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt like I was still dragging Sarah's mess behind me, like an unwanted shadow that clung to everything. I hadn't just lost a wife, I'd lost years of my life, my sense of security, my sanity. And with the debt she left behind, I knew I'd be paying for her betrayal in more ways than one. The house was empty, and I didn't bother trying to fill it. I lived out of cardboard boxes, surrounded by the bare walls and empty rooms that felt like echoes of a life that had crumbled. I had no interest in rebuilding or moving on. Moving on felt like admitting defeat, like letting her win. So I stayed there, in the hollow shell of our life, stewing in the anger that felt more real to me than any attempt at starting over ever could. I tried to distract myself by going after her finances, clawing back whatever I could from the wreckage she'd left me with. I spent hours combing through bank statements and financial records, working with my lawyer to uncover every dollar she'd stashed away for her ex. It felt satisfying in a cold, detached way, like I was chiseling away at the debt with each hour I spent, but it didn't bring peace. It just fed the anger, made it sharper, harder to ignore. Then there were the encounters with people we'd known together, friends, family, people who'd watched us build our life, and who now looked at me with pity. I couldn't stand the way they talk about moving on or finding forgiveness. They had no idea what it felt like to be blindsided, to have the ground ripped out from under you. I started avoiding them, staying away from places where I might run into anyone who'd bring up Sarah or remind me of what I'd lost. I'd rather be alone than hear their empty reassurances or deal with their meaningless sympathy. One night, I ran into Sarah at a bar downtown. She was laughing with some guy, looking like she hadn't a care in the world. Meanwhile, I was drowning in debt, in sleepless nights, in the constant ache of knowing I'd been used. Seeing her there, so carefree, nearly pushed me over the edge. I walked up to her, ready to unleash every ounce of rage I had left, to make her feel even a fraction of the hurt she'd inflicted on me. But when she turned and looked at me, all I saw was indifference, a coldness that told me she'd already moved on. I walked away without a word, realizing that I was the only one still caught in the wreckage. I left the bar, not looking back, feeling a numbness settle over me that I hadn't felt before. It was like the last thread holding me to any sense of closure had snapped, and all that was left was the emptiness of what she'd done. There wasn't going to be any justice, any redemption. She'd stolen years from me, and there was no getting them back. In the weeks that followed, I stopped trying to fix things, stopped looking for ways to claw back what she'd taken. I paid my bills, went to work, came home, and sat in the quiet, letting it all sink in. The anger had burned itself out, and now there was just a hollow ache, a dull resentment that I knew would linger, maybe forever. Some nights I'd sit in the dark, thinking about what life might have been if I'd never met her, if I'd chosen a different path. But those were empty thoughts, and they never led anywhere. I stayed in the house, surrounded by the ghost of a life that had never been real, feeling the weight of the betrayal pressing down on me. There was no fresh start, no new chapter. Just a man, alone, carrying the scars of a love that had turned toxic, a man who knew that sometimes there is no happy ending, just the slow, painful process of surviving what's left.